My name is Mel Lehman. I'm the Director of Common Humanity. We're very glad you're here. Behind me, we have in my studio a representation of what Common Humanity tries to do. We try to use art as a form of bridging a great divide in our world. There's a big divide now between the West and the East, and we're trying to help do our little tiny part to help heal that. Behind me, you see the Amish Mennonite American quilt, which is part of my heritage. And to the other side here, you see some paintings from the Middle East. And in future programs and previous programs, we've talked about that. But today we have a very special role that an artist played in peacemaking. In fact, the title of our program is How a Vietnamese Artist Saved My Life. And the life in question is the good man there beside me, Mr. Doug Hostetter. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you.
Good to have you. Doug is a dear friend of mine for many years, family friend. Let me tell you just a little bit about him, and then we're going to go to hearing from him. Doug Hostetter recently retired after serving 12 years as the director of the Mennonite Central Committee United Nations office, and is currently working part-time as part of the UN representative for Pax Christi International. After graduating from Eastern Mennonite College, now it's Eastern Mennonite University, Doug did his alternate service as a pacifist opposed to war. There was alternate service for conscientious objectors with Mennonite Central Committee in Tam Kỳ, Trung Nam from 1966 to 1969. We're going to hear a lot more about those years in the minutes to come. So let me skip ahead to summarize that Doug was very active broadly in the U.S. anti-Vietnam War protest movement. You'll recall that. Doug has spent his life working for peace with non-governmental peace organizations in Asia, Middle East, Latin America, Europe, and the United States. He has served in leadership positions with the United Methodist Office for the UN, American Friends Service Committee, the Good Quakers, and Fellowship of Reconciliation, an interfaith group. Doug has taught at Goshen College in Indiana and Northwestern University, and he has published widely on the issues of war and peace and nonviolence. Welcome, Doug. What a good record working for peace in this troubled world you have.
Well, it helps to get a good start. And I will tell you, if you spend 3 years as a civilian in a rural village in the middle of a war zone, it will have a profound impact on your life. You will never be the same after that. And so my passion to work to end wars, to prevent wars, to build a more just and peaceful society has come directly out of the 3 years that I served with the Mennonite Central Committee in Vietnam at the height of the Vietnam War. Shall I just go into my experience there and share some of my photos?
Let's do, but just let's add one other point for younger viewers. It's hard to remember what it was like back then. Back when Doug and I were a bit younger, there was what was called a draft for the Vietnam War. And if your number came up, everybody waited for your number. If your number came up, that meant you went over to Nam. And if you saw the movie Forrest Gump, you saw a lot of movies about that experience. Well, Doug was a conscientious objector, so he said, instead of going to war, I'm going for peace. So Doug, let's go there and welcome, yeah. Go ahead.
Actually, I could give a little correction to that. I'm a bit older than you, and actually when I was draft eligible, it was kind of everybody who graduated from college. It was before the lottery. So as long as you were in college, you were exempt. As soon as you graduated, you were 1AO, eligible for the draft. But I grew up in a Mennonite community, and my father and my grandfather were Mennonite ministers. So it was actually relatively easy for me to get a conscientious objector status. And then because I knew so many of my colleagues of my generation were being sent to Vietnam against their will, I decided that it was only right for me as a Mennonite to volunteer to do my alternative service with Mennonite Central Committee in Vietnam at the same time while they were there fulfilling their military obligation carrying guns and shooting mortars and dropping bombs. Shall we move to
Let's do,
Vietnam
yeah.
next?
Let's go, yeah.
Okay, I will, so it'll take just a minute. Okay. I believe you can see those now, can you?
Yeah, very good. There you go. Excellent.
Okay, this was my sister, Pat, and I. Pat was not draft eligible, but many young Mennonites historically have given 2 years of voluntary service somewhere. And Pat had graduated from Goshen College a year earlier, and I had just graduated from Eastern Mennonite College. And actually, independently, we each volunteered when the Mennonite Central Committee recruiter came to our colleges to go to Vietnam to work in the Mennonite Central Committee there, working with refugees and people who were suffering from the war. I come from a large Mennonite family. I have 7 siblings. Pat is my immediately older sister. I have 5 younger brothers and then another older sister. Mennonites have historically been a peace church, and we have, as a part of our faith, refused to participate in war. And I think I can safely say that none of my direct ancestors participated in a war for the last 500 years. But I did want to serve in Vietnam to do alternative service, because Mennonites believe in service. They believe that there are things that we can do to alleviate suffering. So this is the house in Tam Kỳ that I eventually moved into, and the organization that I work for, you can see the sign there, Tổ chức xã hội Tin Lành, was Vietnam Christian Service, of which the Mennonite Central Committee was a part at that time. This is Lê Đình Shum. He was an artist in the village where I was sent, and this is one of his paintings that was in the his front window, which made me curious to want to come in and meet and learn to know the man who had created this painting. I will shift now to doing the pictures basically on a rotation, which will give you a chance to kind of meet the Vietnamese people. Most of them will be about the people and the culture. There will be a few shots on the war, and at the end we'll come back and we'll talk about Lê Đình Shum and his family later on. But these will be background, not directly related, but are related to the work that I was doing while I was there. Let me see whether this shifts or not, or whether I can't. There we go. I think this will go now on a regular rotation. That was what I looked like 50 years ago in Tam Kỳ. So when I went to Vietnam as a Mennonite, there were a lot of things that were actually new to me and strange to me. And one of the things that I believed as a Mennonite before going to Vietnam was that American soldiers who were fighting in Vietnam were probably like the bullies and the mean guys that even in Mennonite communities occasionally you ran across. These were the antisocial people, the people who you wouldn't want to be friends with, people who were hostile and aggressive. And when I got to Vietnam, my biggest surprise, but these were nice, gentle, young Americans. I was also surprised most of them had Southern accents. And I was also surprised that about half of them were people of color, although I knew that was not true of our society back in the United States. And as I worked in Vietnam, in Tam Kỳ, I eventually got to know people who were actually fighting on the other side. And I discovered that the people who were fighting on the other side were very much like the American soldiers who were there. They were actually nice kids. They grew up in good families. They were sent to good Sunday schools. Their kindergarten teacher said, "Don't hit, be nice." This is the kind of upbringing that both the American soldiers in Vietnam and the National Liberation Front that was fighting against the Americans, they were both nice kids who had been brought up in good families and taught good values. And the question that came to me is, how can it be that these peoples who are inherently good people, actually, if you were a bully or antisocial back in those days, you couldn't even get into the US military. I think now they're a little short of people, and there is no longer a draft, so a lot of those people might make it in now. But back in the 60s, those people were rejected. If you had any kind of a criminal record or involvement with drugs or anything like this, you could not get in the US military. You also couldn't get in the National Liberation Front military to fight against the Americans. So that was the big question that I was struggling with while I was serving my time in Vietnam. And I came to the conclusion that actually it's largely because of the propaganda and stereotypes that we believe about the other side. And, you know, the Americans were not said, well, we're going to Vietnam to fight the Vietnamese nationalists who defended their country against the Chinese and then the French and now the Americans. No, we thought of ourselves as valiant soldiers defending the Vietnamese against communists, but that's not how they were described on the other side. On the other side, they were described as the imperialists. And everybody knows who an imperialist is. The imperialists come from big, wealthy countries. They come in and they take the resources of the poor and the weak. They take their wives for concubines or prostitutes, and they steal their resources. And on the other side, we didn't call them the Vietnamese nationalists fighting against the Americans. We called them the Viet Cong. That stood for Vietnamese communist. And everybody knows about communists. You can't talk with a communist. You can't reason with a communist. The only thing that the communists understand is the power of a gun. So if you have good people on both sides, both of which believe the other is an ultimate evil that can't be negotiated with, can't be talked with, that the only thing they understand is the power of the gun, you can actually have a very good war. And I know that this is what Common Humanity is trying to do, and that's also what I was trying to do in Vietnam, was to break those stereotypes. So the first thing I did when I went to Vietnam is, you know, I was sent to Tam Kỳ as the first Mennonite volunteer to go to Tam Kỳ. The director said, go and find out what the people want, and then use MCC resources to help them meet those, accomplish those needs. So I went there and I discovered actually what they really wanted was for their children to learn to read and write Vietnamese. In a wartime situation, the first thing that a military does on enemy territory is you destroy the infrastructure. Well, what's the infrastructure? The infrastructure is the schools, the hospitals, and the marketplaces, all of the places where people congest. And the US and the Saigon government had lost control of the rural areas of Quang Nam province 2 years before I arrived. So when I got there, the infrastructure in the rural areas had already been destroyed. And the children in the refugee camps had not had schooling for 2 years. I realized that, you know, I was just learning Vietnamese myself, and Vietnamese is a difficult tonal language. Cha om, kol chi bui kum, om di dao do. Those are, you know, difficult for Americans to understand and to say. So I was just learning Vietnamese. So I went, and the one thing that I was good at was English. So I taught English in the high schools. And then I used my contacts in the 3 high schools in Tam Kỳ to recruit Vietnamese high school students to be the volunteer teachers in the refugee camps in the summer months and on the weekends. And I used MCC funds to buy the notebooks and books. And we started literacy classes for refugee children. Later on, when the program became better known, rural villages close to Tam Kỳ came to us and started asking us to open schools in their villages as well. And I said, well, we can only do this if you provide a room for the class to take place, if you promise to house and feed the teacher while the high school student while they're there in the summer, and then we'll send somebody out there. So pretty soon, our schools spread in many areas of Quang Tinh province. I also wanted to live very close to the people. When I first went there, there was no hotel, so the options were to stay in the CIA house, which didn't feel like that would be a comfortable place. The military advisors compound, which is where all the military advisors lived, or the U.S. Agency for International Development compound. Well, I thought, well, I'll go to the AID compound. That's at least close to MCC. They're trying to help the people. So I moved in there while I was doing my preliminary research to decide that MCC should come there. But it was very uncomfortable. During the day, Vietnamese could go in and out of the compound. But at night, no Vietnamese, not even guards, were allowed in the compound, except for prostitutes by special arrangement. But no other Vietnamese were ever allowed in the AID compound. And I was not allowed to leave the compound while I was there because they said it's unsafe to be in Tam Kỳ at night because the NLF frequently come in and take over Tam Kỳ, and it would be unsafe for you to be there. And I realized that if I am going to serve as a representative of the Mennonite Central Committee, representing a God who loves all people, I can't be living in an agency compound that's surrounded by landmines and guards. I have to be living in a little cottage in the village. So I rented this little cottage in the village. And the woman who rented it to me said, you know, I have this little 4-foot wall in front of around my yard here. And if you get a few rolls of that concertina wire and put that on top, get a good steel gate for the front yard, and then a 50 caliber machine gun for the front yard. You know, the National Liberation Front come in and take over every few months, and you'll be able to hold them off with the 50 caliber until the Marines can come down and rescue you. And I said, no, Baang, that's not how I want to live. And I never put any barbed wire on top of the 4-foot wall. I never even put a gate in the wall. I had absolutely no defense. Everybody knew that I didn't have a weapon. And one of the things that I learned about nonviolence is that one of the reasons why people kill, especially in wartime, in war zones, is because they are afraid of being killed. And if a pacifist goes out and says, I have no weapons, as a matter of fact, I have nothing to even defend myself, that allows the opportunity for people to see them as a person and not be afraid that they will kill you. So that's the way I lived. And it was interesting. The National Liberation Front took over Tam Kỳ for about a dozen times during the 3 years that I was there. And each time they attacked the USAID compound, the military advisors compound, and the CIA compound, all of which were very heavily guarded. I was the only American living outside of a guarded compound, and my house was never harmed. Now, living that way in Tam Kỳ, broke down some walls for the Vietnamese, because the Vietnamese realized there are some Americans who might not be imperialist. You know, when I first came and was teaching in the high school, I rode my bicycle to the high school. There were 500 bicycles out in front. And for the first week when I came out, every day that I came out for the first week, of the 500 bicycles, there was only one that had 2 flat tires, and that was always mine. But eventually, they began to accept me as a different kind of American. Maybe not all Americans were imperialist. Now, on the other side, living in the middle of Tam Kỳ and not being harmed actually was breaking down the walls of the stereotypes of the Americans. Whenever an American GI would stop me, and I thought I would get a lot of hostility from GIs, the first thing they would ask you, how much do you make? Because they assumed all civilians in Vietnam were making a ton of money. I said, well, MCC gives $15 a month, plus room and board. And it blew them away, because I was making even less than them. And then when they learned that I lived in Tam Kỳ and had no weapon, they could not believe it. They said, how can you live there? I wouldn't go anywhere without my sidearm. I would be totally vulnerable. And I told them, I've never had any problem. Now, it was interesting, although I never had problems with the soldiers, the officers realized that my presence in the middle of the war zone, living at peace, was a threat to the morale of the American soldiers. Because the soldiers could see that the Vietnamese didn't hate all Americans. They hated Americans who were carrying guns and occupying their countries. They didn't hate Americans who were carrying school books and helping to teach their children how to read and write their own language. By the time I left, we had schools, literacy schools in villages that I could travel to on a bicycle that Americans could not travel, American military could not travel in an armored personnel carrier. They were blown away that I could do this. Well, this actually caused some consternation among the military advisors. And they decided that they had to tell MCC that they should withdraw me from the war zone, because it was bad for the morale of soldiers to have a pacifist living at peace in the middle of a war zone. And, I was actually called to come down to Saigon to discuss this with MCC advisors. And actually on the way down, I met a journalist, and he asked me about another volunteer who the military was also trying to kick out of I Corps. That was the northern part of Vietnam, where most of the fighting was taking place at that period of time. And so he asked me about David Nesmith. I told him all about David, who was working for International Voluntary Service. And then I said, the same thing is happening to me. And he said, well, do you mind if I write about this and take your picture? And I said, no. So he wrote about it, first came out in the National Catholic Reporter, and then actually on the front page of the New York Times. And he raised 3 issues. Here are 2 pacifists, one a literacy worker and the other an agriculturalist, who the military that's destroying Vietnam are trying to kick out of a war zone while they are trying to help the Vietnamese people. Then he raised the other 2 issues. Here you have a government agency, the government and the military trying to tell a non-government agency what to do. And here you had a government trying to tell church agency what to do, all of which are not supposed to happen in a democracy, especially in the United States. And so they quickly backed off, apologized, and said no, NGOs in Vietnam could station their staff wherever they pleased. So I came back to Tam Kỳ. And when I came back, the provincial advisor just turned beet red. So I knew he was really, really angry that I was back there. But I thought, well, there's nothing he can do. The policy has changed. But about a month later, one of my Vietnamese high school students who was teaching in my literacy program came to me and said, Doug, he said, my father would like to meet you this weekend. And I said, sure, I'll come over to your house. And she said, no, don't come to my house. I want you to go to my aunt's house. And she told me where her aunt lived at the edge of the village. And so I went, and when I came, he said, I work for the CIA. Well, lots of Vietnamese bullshit and like to talk big. And so I said, sure. And he said, well, I'm supporting my uncle who was killed in the war. So I'm supporting his family and my cousin's family. I'm supporting them. And the Americans, they actually pay pretty well. And I said, does the CIA have a file on me? And he said, of course. And I said, well, what's in my file? He said, well, they have pictures of you. And I said, well, where were the pictures taken? He said, well, I don't know. I said, well, what else is in the file? This is in a little village in Tam Kỳ. And he says, you went to Eastern Mennonite College. You majored in sociology. You're not a communist, but maybe you have friends who are. And in any case, you are hard on the morale of American soldiers. And he said, my daughter is very fond of you, and the CIA has established a new program to try to get rid of you. And I said, what's the program? And he said, the program is we have intelligence agents that come in from the countryside each month to tell us who are the locally elected officials in the communist-held areas. And then we try to kill those officials, because in a communist-held area, any official that's elected would obviously be a communist official. And so we have to try to kill them. But when they come in next month, we will tell them that Doug Hostetter is a deep cover CIA agent. And I said, well, thank you for telling me this. But I said, do you have any advice or counsel for me? And he said, no, I don't have any advice or counsel. But I will say that my daughter is very fond of you, and she very much appreciates the literacy work that you're doing in Tam Kỳ. So I went back to Tam Kỳ, and I talked to my closest friends. And my first friend was a Protestant pastor there, a Vietnamese Protestant pastor. And I said, Pastor Kang, I said, what do you think we should do? He said, well, you can't leave Tam Kỳ. Now that the rumor is getting out that you are a deep cover CIA agent, if you leave Tam Kỳ, it will confirm that rumor, and the Mennonites can never send any other volunteers back to Tam Kỳ. So I said, well, what can we do? He said, we can pray. He said, me and my congregation, we will pray for you. So my other very close friend was the artist, Layden Shum. So I went to the artist and I said, Shum, I said, what should I do? And he said, he thought for a little and he said, you need to trust that your friends know who you really are. I never understood what that meant until 45 years later when I returned to Vietnam. And I returned to Vietnam because about 10 years ago, one of the high school students that was in my literacy program immigrated to the United States. And he immediately emailed me and said, I just arrived in the US, can we catch up? So he came over, came to my house, and we caught up. This person lived, this person died, this happened to this person got married to this person, all of the gossip that happens after 45 years. He had been back in Tam Kỳ as a high school teacher when the end of the war happened in 1975. And he said, the most surprising thing was, he said, do you remember that friend of yours, the artist, Layden Shum? He said, when the war ended, it turns out he had an older brother he had never told us about. And that older brother was a high-level official in North Vietnam. And I said, wow, well, that's really interesting. So 10 years, so I immediately tried to find Layden Shum on the, and he also said the artist friend of yours became the Minister of Education for our province under the new government. So I tried to find him. My friend knew what village he had retired to when he had retired a few years earlier. So I was able to eventually find someone in there with an email address, and I emailed them and I said, here's a picture of the artist Layden Shum. He was a good friend of mine. Would you please try to find him? I'm trying to get back in touch with him. So about a week later, he emailed back. This was a Protestant pastor in that village. And he said, I never found Layden Shum, but I found his daughter. And she'll be here to email with you if you email me next week at this time. So I emailed back, and Fung Long was there. And she said, I'm very sorry. My father died 2 years ago, but you were a very close friend of our families. You were like an uncle to me. And she said, if you ever get a chance to come back to Vietnam, please come and visit. We would love to host you. So I will shift now to try to get out of this and get to the set of pictures I have on Layden Shum and his family. This was, so actually about, it would have been 7 years ago, I got a chance to return to Vietnam with an anti-war delegation that was coming to Vietnam to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the treaty that ended the American War. So I'll shift back, try to get this new set of photos here, and we'll see how this goes. Okay, this is Layden Shum. I'll try to stop this here. So when I went back, whoa, I have to see if this is the two of us together. And actually, this is Layden Shum's sister. Actually, when my friend came back and told me that he had an older brother that we had never learned about, it suddenly dawned on me. I had met his sister, his aunts, and a whole host of female relatives, but I had never met any male relatives of Layden Shum, except for his son, who was very young at the time. So I went back with this delegation for the official commemorations in Hanoi and Saigon, but I said, I have to break off for a few days just to visit my old friends. So I went back to visit Fung Long, and I was amazed when I got back there to discover that, and here's a picture of Fung Long now. Here's what she looked like when I left in 1969. So about 45 years later, when we came back, she warmly welcomed me into her home. She's now a classical musician. She plays the 32-string zither in a Vietnamese traditional orchestra that plays in the village of Hoi An, very close to where they grew up. And I discovered that not only did Layden Shum have one older brother in Hanoi, he actually had 3 brothers that were living in Quang Nam province on the other side. 2 were killed during the war, and 1 survived. When I returned to visit the family, I met the 2 brothers who survived. Before, I had also met Layden Shum's father. Actually was killed in 1968 by Allied troops. He was in his 70s at that time. He had been driven from his village. He went back, walking back to his village as an old man, refusing to live in the refugee camps. When he was killed, when they got and retrieved his body, he had his glasses, his cane, 2 books of poetry, and 1 book of traditional medicine. After he was killed, I met Layden Shum's mother for the first time, a beautiful, beautiful woman. They were both scholars, and and teachers, but lived in the area controlled by the National Liberation Front. So it was amazing to return 45 years later to discover that the children of my best friend, it was the family of my best friend. In addition to, I'm sure God was protecting me while I was there, but also my best friend, whose brothers were all on the other side, was also one of the active people protecting my life while I was there for about the dozen times when the National Liberation Front came in to take over Tam Kee. I thank you.
Thank you, Doug. What a great, great story. We have a few minutes left. We have a tradition of asking everyone on our program, what is something that we can do for peace? People like us who don't get a chance to travel to war zones, what is something that we can do in our own lives to work for peace in this very troubled world of ours?
Well, as I said, the primary task of a peacemaker is to break through the walls of stereotypes. So refuse to accept stereotypes of the enemy. Whenever you get a chance to meet an enemy face to face, meet them, welcome them into your homes, eat with them, share with them, learn their experience, learn their lives. I'm currently doing this with North Korean diplomats and Iranian diplomats here in New York that are deemed by my government to be, the absolute epitome of evil. And I'm welcoming them into my home. I'm helping to raise funds to assist them in their time of need. So anything that you can do to break through enemy stereotypes is incredibly essential. Refuse to believe stereotypes, and know that probably the most profound peace building thing that anyone can do is to build a human relationship with someone on the other side. I mean, this whole experience in Vietnam showed me that a human relationship can be powerful enough to bridge religious, political, and national differences. Lê Đình Shum was a Buddhist. I don't know whether he was ever really a communist, but he certainly was a nationalist and against the Americans. He came from a country that my country was at war with, and yet we became closest friends. And in time of need, he protected me. And while I was there, I used the resources that I had to try to educate the children of the war that my country that was destroying.
Thank you, Doug, for this great, great story. Let's see if I can share my screen for a moment and see if we have where people can get more information. Here is a resource called Mennonite Central Committee. And if you go there, type in The Making of a Peacemaker, Doug Hostetter, you'll come up with some really great further information.
Type in rememberingvietnam.org is where you'll get to this website. Rememberingvietnam.org. .net, excuse me. .net, not .org. And this is a website completely dedicated to Vietnam. And you can find stories from many of the Mennonite volunteers who worked in Vietnam over the last 65 years.
Rememberingvietnam.net.
Right.
One other place I would like you to consider visiting is commonhumanity.org. We are working, we will continue to be broadcasting through these pandemic times. This winter, you're stuck inside, tune us in. We're going to have more programs, great programs with great guests like Doug, artists, and other peacemakers. Visit our website, commonhumanity.org. You'll see posters for sale. Christmas is not that far away. How about a poster to help support refugees, to help support common humanity? Your gifts would be grateful. We have to pay the rent, we have to pay the cable, we have to pay the computers. So doing this takes some funds. We'd be grateful for your contributions. Come back next week. Thank you, Doug, for a great visit. It's great to be your friend and great to have you share with us today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, folks. Come back next week and come back in the future and visit commonhumanity.org. Thank you very much. See you, Doug. Thanks again.
Thank you.